we began talking about forming urine and renal physiology, we said there were 3 steps to this process. The first step was glomerular filtration that we just finished talking about, where in the glomerulus, the blood plasma and the dissolved substances, really small things, get filtered from the blood into the glomerular capsule. The second phase is tubular reabsorption. So all along the renal tubule and the collecting duct, water, ions, and other substances get reabsorbed or saved from the renal tubule into the peritubular capillaries and then back into the blood. The third phase is tubular secretion. So all along the renal tubule and the collecting duct also, substances like waste products, drugs, and excess ions get secreted from the blood in the peritubular capillaries into the renal tubule so that it can make its way into the urine and leave the body. So reabsorption is saving something, get it out of the filtrate and back into the blood. Secretion is getting rid of something, take it from the blood and get it into the filtrate so that it can be excreted as a part of the urine. Normally, about 99% of the filtered water is resorbed, saved. Epithelial cells all along the renal tubule and the collecting duct are going to resorb, but the proximal convoluted tubule cells make the largest contribution to resorption. Solutes that get resorbed include glucose, amino acids, nitrogenous waste, ions like sodium, potassium, calcium, bicarb, phosphates. So whatever it is that's being resorbed from the fluid in the lumen of the tubule can take one of 2 routes before it gets back into the peritubular capillaries and in the blood. It can either move between neighboring cells in the tubule. So here's the inside of the tubule, that's where our filtrate is. These are the cells that make up the wall of the tubule. So paracellular, near or between the cells, is a passive type of transport where molecules diffuse from the filtrate between the cells because they're not completely sealed off where they attach to each other. So things move across or between, the cells out into the interstitial fluid and then get resorbed into the peritubular capillary. Again, this is passive. It doesn't require energy. Other things move across the cell, transcellular. Now, in order to move something across a cell, we typically are going to use pumps. As you know, pumps require energy. So to move across the cell, we'll look at sodium here. Sodium gets moved into the cell. Of course, that's going to be endocytosis. And then sodium-potassium pumps are going to hydrolyze ATP and utilize that energy to pump sodium out. Either way, we end up with something moving from inside the tubule to the surrounding tissues so that it can be resorbed back into the blood. Normally, we remove all of the glucose that might get filtered out during glomerular filtration back into the blood. But when the concentration of glucose is extremely high, then these renal transporters can't work fast enough to resorb all the glucose that enters the filtrate. This results in some glucose remaining in the urine, and that's a condition called glucosuria. The most common cause of this is something you've heard of before when we talked about the endocrine system. That's right, diabetes mellitus. So blood glucose levels rise way above the normal because insulin's not doing its job, or there's a lack of insulin. Excess glucose in the filtrate is going to inhibit water resorption by the kidney tubules, and this leads to increased urinary output, polyuria. If we're losing excess water, decreased blood volume, and ultimately it can lead to dehydration. Okay, so far we've filtered the blood, glomerular filtration, and created the filtrate. In reabsorption, we've saved some of the water, most of the water, and some of the solutes. Now, secretion is the third phase the third function of the nephrons in the collecting ducts. And it transfers materials from the blood and the tubules into the filtrate. So things that we don't want to keep in the body move from the blood into that filtrate. These include hydrogen ions, ammonium ions, creatinine, and drugs. So tubular secretion has two important outcomes: the secretion of hydrogen ions that helps to control blood pH, and the secretion of other substances so we can eliminate them from the body in the urine. About 90% of reabsorption of water filtered by the kidneys is going to occur along with the reabsorption of solutes like sodium and chloride and glucose. Water reabsorbed with solutes in tubular fluids is called obligatory water absorption because the water is obliged to follow the solutes when they're reabsorbed. This type of reabsorption occurs in the proximal convoluted tubules and the descending limb of the nephron loop because these segments of the nephron are always permeable to water, so the water passes across very easily. Reabsorption of the final 10% or so of the water is termed facultative reabsorption. So facultative means capable of adapting to a need. So resorption of the facultative water is regulated by ADH, and this occurs mostly in the collecting ducts. The largest amount of solute and water reabsorption from the filtered fluid is going to occur in the proximal convoluted tubules, which resorb about 65% of the filtered out water, the sodium, potassium ions, 100% of organic substances like glucose and amino acids, about half of the chloride ions, most of the bicarbs, most of the urea, magnesium, calcium, phosphates, so lots of nutrients, water, and electrolytes. Now let's think about what's going on here. So as solute reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubules is happening, it's going to promote osmosis of water. Each solute that is resorbed, now remember that means coming out of the tubule and getting into the interstitial fluid and then back into the blood. So each solute that is resorbed is increasing the osmolarity inside the tubule. And then as those solutes move into the interstitial fluid, the osmolarity increases there. And then finally, once these solutes move into the blood, it increases the osmolarity of the blood. And what do we know? Osmotic pressure, increased osmolarity, is going to cause water to move as well. So water moves rapidly from the tubular fluid into the peritubular capillaries and helps to restore osmotic balance. So as the water leaves the tubular fluid, the concentration of the filtrate solutes increases in the fluid because we just lost water. As the proximal convoluted tubule is resorbing the water and the nutrients, the fluid then is going to pass into the descending limb of the loop of Henle, or the nephron loop. So lots and lots of water being resorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule and the descending limb of the loop of Henle. But hardly any water, if any, is resorbed in the ascending limb of the nephron loop. So in this segment of the tubule, the cell membranes are pretty much impermeable to water, so water can't pass, but ions can. So ions are going to continue to be absorbed as that filtrate passes through the ascending loop. So the osmolarity of the tubular fluid decreases because ions are leaving and being resorbed. So the osmolarity is decreasing as the fluid flows toward the end of the ascending limb into the distal convoluted tubule. By the time the filtrate reaches the end of the distal convoluted tubule, about 90 to 95% of the filtered solutes in the water have returned to the bloodstream. So it began in the filtrate, we've resorbed, about 90 to 95% has been removed. So the cells resorb the sodium and secrete potassium in the distal convoluted tubule. But these cells have receptors for aldosterone and ADH. So the distal convoluted tubule cells are going to be very, very receptive to the effects of hormones, and this is what is going to primarily drive water and sodium resorption in the distal convoluted tubule. So we mentioned hormones affecting the distal convoluted tubule. So let's look briefly at those 5 hormones that affect the way that sodium and calcium and water are going to be absorbed, and also how potassium is excreted. Remember, sodium and potassium always go in different directions, right? So these hormones include angiotensin II, aldosterone, ADH, atrial natriuretic peptide, and parathyroid hormone. So let's begin with the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. This should be very familiar to you because we talked about this with the endocrine system. We talked about this with blood pressure. So when blood volume and blood pressure decrease, the walls of the afferent arteriole, remember, headed into the glomerulus, they're going to be stretched less. And the juxtaglomerular cells are going to secrete an enzyme called renin into the blood. Renin is going to drive that conversion of angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1 and then to angiotensin 2. So how does angiotensin 2 affect what's going on with renal physiology? There are 3 different ways. It decreases glomerular filtration rate by causing vasoconstriction of the afferent arterioles. It enhances the reabsorption of sodium by causing sodium-potassium transporters to be embedded in the proximal convoluted tubule. So we retain more sodium, therefore we retain more water. And it also stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. And of course we know that aldosterone is going to cause us to resorb more sodium and excrete more potassium. And when we resorb more sodium using those sodium-potassium pumps, that means water is going to follow. So we have an increase in blood volume and an increase in blood pressure. Again, more familiar hormones. Antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, is released by the posterior pituitary, and it regulates that facultative water reabsorption by increasing the water permeability of the cells in the last part of the distal convoluted tubule and throughout the entire collecting duct. So when you don't have ADH, the cells in the last part of the distal convoluted tubule have a very low permeability to water. The ADH stimulates insertion of aquaporins into the membranes of these cells, and as a result, water permeability in the membrane increases dramatically, and the water molecules move more rapidly from the tubular fluid into the blood. This results in an increase in blood volume, and as we know, that increases blood pressure. A large increase in blood volume or blood pressure is going to cause the release of atrial natriuretic peptide from the heart. So this ANP can inhibit the reabsorption of sodium, and that also affects water, right? Because we know wherever sodium goes, water goes. So it inhibits the reabsorption of sodium and water in the proximal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. It also suppresses the secretion, so it has an antagonistic effect on aldosterone and ADH. Now remember, both of those are going to cause us to retain water, aldosterone by causing us to retain sodium. So these effects of ANP increase the excretion of sodium. And of course we know water follows, so this increases urine output, which decreases blood volume, therefore decreases blood pressure. And then our 5th hormone that we want to talk about is parathyroid hormone. So the ones we've talked about before, the 4 hormones, are going to be directly responsible in regulation of water loss in the urine. But the kidney tubules also are going to respond to hormones that regulate ionic composition. So, for example, if you have a lower than normal level of calcium in the blood, that's going to stimulate the parathyroid glands to release parathyroid hormone, right? Parathyroid hormone then stimulates cells in the distal convoluted tubule to resorb more calcium, because parathyroid hormone is released when our calcium levels in the blood are low. So we don't want to be excreting and urinating out more calcium. So PTH makes the distal convoluted tubules absorb more calcium out of that fluid and back into the blood.